Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and namaste. Thank you so much for those of you joining me in the room. Thanks to those of you joining me on Zoom. And thanks to those of you listening to the recording after. Welcome to a little Dharma talk that I like to call Living from the Heart, all about this 18-inch spiritual journey, which can sometimes take many lifetimes, simply to travel from the head to the heart. I like to start with a poem of my own as a lead-in to this week's teaching. We'll follow with a short meditation to integrate what we've talked about, and finally, have some time at the end for question and answer. And the topic for this week is on the deeper meaning behind common Zen stories. And today's poem is called The Dawn Chorus. I wrote this poem after learning that scientists refer to the songs that the birds sing in the morning as the dawn chorus. I thought it was such wonderful imagery. Notice how the birds take shifts. The stars become a whisper, the mountains assume their presence, and high enough for the golden fingers of light to nudge them awake are the robins and blackbirds. Big birds with big eyes and big pupils, seeing better in darkness, they sing because they feel safe. The light gets bigger, the birds get smaller. The proud chaffinch, feathers splattered in the colors of zebras and oak, fills the air with its presence. The air is still too still to fly. The insects still soundly dreaming. They sing because there is nothing else to do. The dew disappears. The composition of singers change. The baton is handed off to the finches and thrushes, the smallest orange and yellow streaks. They sing music that never repeats, but is recognized immediately. They sing to proclaim their existence. Listener, listen. Do not let trauma stifle your song. Do not become the plowing oxen forever bound to progress. Do not let the packed subway car crowd out your unique voice. Welcome the upwelling of purpose within you, and let your present heart paint its song across the clear blue sky. So today's talk is all about stories and how stories can be quite powerful. And it's important to recognize that our mind is made for stories. It helps us to remember, to recollect information in our lives. For millennia, far before the written word, humans have told stories to each other in the center of town squares, around the campfire. Humans have always been entertained by stories. And it's important to recognize that you too have a story. And in fact, it is being written right now. And there is an entire discipline known as narrative psychology. And one of the key findings of narrative psychology is that people are more mentally and emotionally well off when they have a beautiful story, when they have what is known as narrative coherence, the extent to which an individual is able to construct coherent accounts of their autobiographical memories. So Dan Siegel, a prominent child psychotherapist, has said that a healthy mind is always moving towards integration and differentiation. And this is what a story is designed to do. It's designed to make sense and make meaning of different events of our life and discover how they are all linked together. And in so doing, knowing how our past is shaping our present, we are better able to tell a better story for the future. So in therapy, if I'm working with a client, for example, and I ask them to tell me about their childhood, and they don't have much to say, like, oh, I had a pretty good childhood. Oh, I don't remember much of my childhood. Those sentences are a wonderful signpost pointing to some areas that might need to be worked on because mentally, we construct stories all the time. And we will always want to be constructing a positive narrative of our life and to understand where we are by understanding all the events that led up to who we are today. So the poet May Sarton wrote this in her poem, Now I Become Myself. Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces, run madly as if time were there, terribly old, crying a warning. Hurry, you will be dead before what? Before you reach the morning, or the end of the poem is clear, or love safe in the walled city. Now to stand here, to be here, feel my own weight and density. The black shadow on the paper is my hand. The shadow of a word, as thought shapes the shaper, falls heavy on the page, is heard. All fuses now, falls into place from wish to action, word to silence. My work, my love, my time, my face, gathered into one intense gesture of growing like a plant. As slowly as the ripening fruit, fertile, detached, and always spent, falls but does not exhaust the root. So all the poem is, can give, grows in me to become the song, made so and rooted by love. Now there is time and time is young. Oh, in this single hour I live all of myself and do not move. I, the pursued, who madly ran, stand still, and stop the sun. So when we remember, when we recollect the different events of our life, it offers an opportunity to spin these yarns, to spin these stories into a beautiful narrative. And sometimes that narrative turns into a poem, into a song, and we can literally turn our life into a poem, into a song. And this is part of our spiritual path and part of our spiritual awakening. So, stories are really powerful for our own mental and emotional well being. And they are also powerful for our collective spiritual, mental, and emotional well being. So, any good story is always going to have multiple layers of meaning. And when you hear a good story, it's going to mean different things depending on where you are in your life. And I know many parents who love a good Pixar movie or love a good Sesame Street show. And a huge reason for this is because the writers know that often parents watch television with their children. So the writers are going to put in multiple layers of meaning and references for different minds to pick up upon. So they write little in jokes, little references that they know only parents will understand, and the children won't even notice. In the same way, good spiritual stories are also going to have multiple meanings for different experience levels of practitioners. It's going to have meaning for both a novice, who this is the first time hearing the story, and practitioners alike are going to unite this story with what they already know about great wisdom teachings. So when we look at the Bible, When we look at the Mahabharata and Ramayana, these are all a compilation of really incredible stories that will always have multiple layers of meaning and multiple ways to interpret these stories, whether metaphorically, historically, narratively, or allegorically. We can always interpret stories in different ways to elucidate different meaning. This is why we can read these stories and again, hundreds of times across our lifetime. So 10 years ago, perhaps you read the Bhagavad Gita and you take a certain surface level approach because your wisdom of Hindic mythology and philosophy and religion hasn't quite gotten to the point where you can understand all the references and allusions in the story. And then 10 years later, you are a very different person and you are going to read and interpret that story very differently. So I always, at least once a year, come back to the Bhagavad Gita, come back to the Tao Te Ching, and every single time I learn things that I never learned before. I extract new meaning that I never would have earlier on in my spiritual path. So there's other great texts too, like the Upanishads, like the Vedas, and even Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And if you enjoy reading these texts, I absolutely salute you. I am impressed because these do tend to be fairly dry, really high philosophical concepts that don't have that narrative structure to kind of keep the mind going through it as you read. And by and large, yogic texts are divided into two categories. There is shruti, that which is heard, and smriti, that which is remembered. And it's the smriti that tend to have all the amazing and incredible stories. And it's just like sitting around a campfire where someone stands up and says, I'm going to recollect this story. And it's amazing how before the written word, we even had people in society whose sole purpose was to remember stories, was to be the collective wisdom of the culture in stories that they would then pass down generation to generation to generation. So I wanted to offer just a few different stories for you. And many of these stories you've probably heard. If you've even listened to a few of my talks, I've also told some of these stories. And I'll go into some different ways to interpret these stories and some deeper meanings we could potentially extract from these stories that maybe you are not quite aware of yet. So, as many stories often begin, there is a young disciple and their teacher, and they are walking along in the forest. And these are Zen monks walking along mindfully, silently together. And after a couple hours, the novice gets a little fed up and says, okay, we've been walking in silence for a fairly long time. Can you please teach me the nature of Zen? And the teacher looks at his young disciple and asks, do you hear the waterfall off in the distance? And at first, the novice doesn't hear anything at all. A waterfall in the distance? I don't hear the sound of any rushing water. So the disciple pauses, takes a few breaths, quiets the mind, and then says, yes, master, I hear it. And the master says, enter the Zen from there. And sometimes there's a continuation of this story where the master and disciple continue to walk. The disciple asks, but master, what if I didn't hear the waterfall? And the master says, then enter the Zen from there. So there's both immediate meanings we can extract from this story and also some deeper levels of understanding that we can take. First of all, it's a great story. It's a little humorous, it's a little cheeky, it's something that we can all understand. And it's a story that begins like so many other Zen stories that involve a disciple and a teacher. And there's a reason this story is the way it is. Because many say that Buddhism is a dialogue. Buddhism is not some rote doctrine that you need to memorize and follow. It exists in dialogue between student and teacher, where essentially the student goes to the teacher and says something to the extent of, I am suffering, or I cannot put my mind to rest. Different layers of some discomfort, some dis-ease, some dissatisfaction. And they go to the teacher and they say, can you help me with this? Clearly, you seem to have something special going on here at your temple, at your monastery. And you too, as the teacher, you also seem to exude a certain level of peace, calm, and serenity. So I really want to understand your secret. And the master is always a little cheeky to hearing a disciple talk about their suffering. And what they'll tend to do is put the disciple in a little bit of a bind, a little bit of a conundrum. He might even shoo away the disciple and say, we don't have anything to teach here at this temple. We don't have any teachings at all. And then the disciple either leaves upon hearing that there's nothing actually to learn here, or they become even more persistent. And in this way, Zen teachings are often described as almost deceiving a child with a clenched fist. And as you hold out a clenched fist to a child, the child clearly wants to see what's inside of your clenched fist. So they kind of start to pry your fingers open and you say, not yet, not yet. And the child continues to be interested and continues to be interested until you open your hand to reveal nothing at all. So sometimes the master is sort of saying, we have absolutely nothing to teach you, but that doesn't convince the disciple, it doesn't convince the student that there's something truly deep to learn here. And the master will put the student in another bind, and he might say something like, well, you are suffering, you cannot put your mind to rest. All you have to do is release all desire. All you have to do is completely let go. And the disciple is like, okay, I'll try that out. And immediately realizes the paradox of trying very hard to let go of things, of trying very hard and wanting very deeply to release all desire. Because even desiring to release desire is still desire. And a more famous way that masters get their disciples to tie themselves into knots is with famous Zen koans. And this is pretty unique and distinct to Zen traditions to basically give a student an unsolvable conundrum, an unsolvable problem or unsolvable statement or question to get them to reach the absolute end of their logical reasoning and end of what the mind could potentially contemplate to discover that which goes beyond the mind. So it's important to recognize this dialogue is something that has happened for centuries upon centuries. A disciple having trouble not understanding and asking their teacher to explain something to them. So even in psychology, we have this saying that anybody who goes to a psychiatrist ought to have their head examined. Basically, if you think you have a problem, you have a problem. And even psychology, by and large, does take a client's word for it. If you have a condition that is causing you suffering, it's worth it to go to therapy. If you have a condition that's not causing you any suffering at all, there's no reason to work through a therapist for it. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions, but you get the basic idea that it's the disciple that is going to the Zen master. It's not the master that is going out and seeking disciples and seeking followers. It's saying, oh, you are suffering and you want to get rid of it. Well, you are in the right place. So the first lesson, of course, from this story is that we are here to quiet the mind. And that is the first thing that the disciple does. They take a few breaths, they quiet the mind, and suddenly they can hear the waterfall. And this is a very common metaphor that you will find that spirituality is the art of listening. Our task is to listen. This is why we ring bells to begin meditation. This is why sound has always been a crucial part of the spiritual path, whether you're singing kirtan, doing the call to prayer, or ringing bells to wake people up in the morning. Sound has always been a crucial part of spiritual teachings. And our mind is always described as being turbulent, the monkey mind, the puppy mind. And it's hard to listen to the world and to others when our mind is continuously going 24/7. One of my teachers, John Prendergast, said it's really hard to listen to another human being when you have a radio on going at full blast in your own head. So much of our spiritual practice is designed to quiet the mind, to turn down the volume knob of the mind that gets in the way of us truly being able to listen and being present for other people. So we're here to hear the waterfall just as much as we are here to listen to the birds and to listen to all the beautiful sounds around us. We're here to wake up the ears as much as we are to wake up the rest of the body and mind on this path towards enlightenment, on this path towards Buddhahood or awakening. Now, the second part of the story is also quite interesting because he says, what if I didn't hear the waterfall? And the master says, well, enter the Zen from there. And there's two main ways to interpret this second part of the story. I think the first surface level interpretation is that whatever is happening to you right now in this moment can be a vehicle for awakening. Just as you might have a sitting meditation, you can have a driving to work meditation, a waiting in line at the grocery store meditation, eating, sleeping, going to sleep. These are all times to practice. Every moment is an opportunity to practice. So whether you are happy in this moment or sad in this moment, whether you are grateful in this moment or confused in this moment, every experience of life offers an opportunity to awaken. And we can use whatever life presents to us externally or internally to wake up, to enter the Zen, to enter this moment. I was even thinking about this today as I was driving down the street, and suddenly the person in front of me put on their brake lights and started driving very, very slowly. And at first, I got a little frustrated. And then I remembered the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh to use brake lights as a reminder to be present, to slow down, and to almost see those brake lights as the eyes of the Buddha looking back at you. So all of our difficulties in life can be used as grist for the mill, can be used as an opportunity to wake up. So if you hear the waterfall, wake up. If you don't hear the waterfall, you can wake up. Hence, an old Chinese master, Tokuzan, would say, if you ask any question, you get 30 blows with my stick. If you don't ask any question, you get 30 blows just the same. So again, this could just be the master shooing away the disciple, but we can also take it to mean whatever happens in our life, it is the same. We are here to wake up. But I think for me, I really like thinking about the second half of the story as an embrace of the don't know mind, of the beginner's mind. And I think this is important when we are able to see our sacred texts as stories. Suddenly, we shift from forcing upon others a particular interpretation of the story to embracing all the different ways that people can live these stories. I do believe our spiritual practice can be one of embracing the mystery rather than an enforcement of certainty. So the term beginner's mind became very popular with the famous book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shinryu Suzuki, who was in the Soto Zen tradition. But for me, I much prefer the term don't know mind, because now that beginner's mind has become such a popular term, it's almost impossible to use the term beginner's mind from a stance of beginner's mind. We think that we have such a deep understanding of what beginner's mind means. So I do find it's very useful to shift to don't know mind, Do you hear the waterfall in the distance? I don't know. Does a waterfall actually exist, or is it just a continuation of a certain condition? Right? I don't know. Do you exist, or is it an illusion? I don't know. And it's that I don't know that opens us up to the mystery, that opens us up to the great unknowable unknown. So that's a few ways to think about this story. And now that we've already talked about Buddhism as dialogue, as the relationship between disciple and master, we can find another story that involves two monks walking together. And again, you've probably heard this story where two monks are walking together through the forest and they get to the edge of a river. And on their side of the river, they find a woman who is struggling to cross. And as stories go, people love to embellish the stories that they tell each time. So sometimes the woman has medicine for her sick child or sick parent and they need to cross, right? There's always different ways to raise the stakes of the story. But what happens next is the master monk or the older monk picks up the woman, carries her across the river, sets her down, and then disciple and master continue along the way. And after about a few hours, the disciple, very distraught, finally speaks to his master and says, "You know what? I can't believe you carried that woman across the water. You know, we are not allowed to touch women." And the master looks at his student and says, "Are you still carrying her? I let go of her 2 hours ago." So I think the surface level interpretation, which is a perfectly valid interpretation, and when I say surface level, I'm not saying we need to discount this. We can embrace multiple levels of meaning. And the initial interpretation of this story is to let go of the past. In our task of being present, we want to let go of the past and we want to let go of the future. In this case, we have a younger monk who, again, is suffering, who feels a certain level of mental rumination that he simply can't hold within himself. And he is just forced to confront his master teacher about it. And the master's teaching is quite simple: just let it go, just let go of the past. So letting go of the past to be fully present in this moment is one way to think about this story. But when we go deeper into this practice of letting go, we recognize what we essentially want to cultivate is a mind that doesn't stick to anything. And in this case, a situation happened, and the student's mind got stuck. It got stuck not only in the past, but also in a physical location in the past that the disciple and monk had already gone by. So there's so many sayings along the lines of do not let any thought leave a trace in your mind. Just like when you walk across a room and you don't leave any footprints, or the way the birds do not leave tracks across the sky, we don't want any thought, emotion, or sensation to leave a trace in our mind. We want to cultivate such a spacious mind that everything is allowed to simply pass through. We don't want to attach to any conceptual thinking, because that's another thing about this young disciple. He was caught up and he kept ruminating and feeding into his thoughts, and thoughts feeding into his emotions, emotions feeding into thoughts. And finally, he was forced and compelled to finally confront his teacher. But as we say, you can't hammer a nail against the sky, nor can you spit against the sky. It's not going to land on anything. So in this case, the master has cultivated a certain level of mental spaciousness that there's no stickiness, there's no residual trace of what happens to him in his life. Now, another thing that's very important to recognize about monkhood And different traditions are going to have different levels of strictness to their vows that they take. But in the case of the Theravadan branch of Buddhism, these people do tend to be very traditional and have very strict rules that all monks are supposed to follow. So this isn't just a simple occurrence. Monks have vowed to not touch a member of the opposite sex. And even when I was in Thailand and studying Buddhism, I was at a monk chat where some of us attendees were able to sit at a table around a monk and kind of ask him whatever questions we wanted to ask. And one of the female members there asked the monk if he was thirsty. He said yes. And then he said, but you can't hand me the water bottle. If you set your water bottle down, I can pick it up and I can drink out of it. And the two main reasons for this is in the passing of the water bottle, you don't want to unintentionally create physical contact, which sometimes happens, right? When you hand somebody something. But also, any giving, any dana or generosity needs to be given freely and taken freely. So, in the setting down of the water bottle and the separate picking up of the water bottle, we have created good karma for everyone involved. So it's not just like this student was irrational in his beliefs. In his mind, the master monk had done a severe transgression, which brings us to another lesson. This is a lesson of upaya. And upaya is often translated to mean skillful means. And upaya basically says that all enlightened people are going to specifically tailor their message to their specific audience. So there's one person that this teaching was made for, and it is the student. The master here specifically did exactly what he needed to do to bring his disciple closer to enlightenment. So another key concept we can take from this story is skillful means, is upaya, that a teacher will use skillful means to deliver the right teaching to a student in the most effective manner. So anytime, again, you hear of a story of master and disciple, we must recognize this is a specific master giving a specific teaching to a specific disciple that that disciple needs to hear in that moment. In this case, we have a disciple that is overly attached to rules and obligations, and the master is there to encourage this disciple to let go of those things. And I love the concept of upaya because we can really expand it to all areas of our life. Our task is to become more skillful in all areas of our life. So in Buddhist thought, there is no right or wrong. There is no blanket, objectively right or wrong thing that you can do. There is only being more skillful and less skillful. There is only being more mindful and less mindful. So we are always trying to be more skillful in our actions, which also means we can let go of the judgment we have on ourselves that we did something bad, along with the judgment that we did something right. And we can accept our imperfections, recognizing that we are trying our best. And every mistake that we make is an opportunity to correct that mistake and to learn from it and become more skillful and more mindful in our thoughts and in our actions. And I think this is a key lesson that many of us can take when we do begin this practice of compassion, of alleviating the suffering of others, because we don't want to get trapped in what is sometimes referred to as idiot compassion or blind compassion, because we want to be skillful in our compassion, which means combining it with wisdom, and understanding. And Robert Masters talks about blind compassion in his book, Spiritual Bypassing. And he writes, blind compassion is rooted in the belief that we are all doing the best we can. That's the good thing. But when we are driven by blind compassion, we cut everyone far too much slack, making excuses for others' behavior and making nice situations that require a forceful no, an unmistakable voicing of displeasure, or a firm setting and maintaining of boundaries. These things can and often should be done out of love, but blind compassion keeps love too meek, sentenced to wearing a kind face. So, some of you might even be familiar with the work of Kristen Neff, who became famous for her earlier work on self compassion. And after a few decades of working with self compassion, she's like, I really have to emphasize that compassion does not mean that you are a rug that is going to get walked over. Sometimes compassion requires a forceful no, a firm boundary. And we can become blindly compassionate if we simply allow and enable harmful behavior from others. So Sharon Salzberg has a wonderful story elucidating combining our compassion with wisdom and sometimes being fierce in our compassion. The rickshaw man took us by shortcuts through dark streets and down back alleys of Calcutta. At one point, suddenly out of nowhere, an extremely big man approached the rickshaw driver and stopped him. Then he looked at me, grabbed me, and tried to pull me off the rickshaw. I looked around the streets for help. There were a lot of people everywhere, as there often are in India, but I did not see a single friendly face. I thought, oh my God, this guy is going to drag me off and rape me. Then he is going to kill me, and nobody is going to help me. My friend, who was sitting with me in the rickshaw, managed to push the drunken man away and urged the rickshaw driver to go on. So we escaped and got to the station. I was very shaken and upset when we both arrived in Bodh Gaya. I told Munindra, one of my meditation teachers, what had happened. He looked at me and said, Oh, Sharon, with all the loving kindness in your heart, you should have taken your umbrella and hit that man over the head with it. So, this is what it means to combine compassion with our wisdom. This is what it means to apply skillful means. Absolutely, ahimsa, the practice of non harming, is the deepest and most foundational ethical principle that we can bring to our yogic practice. We bring in ahimsa to our life by practicing vegetarianism, by having a broom in front of us as we walk along the meditation path to sweep away any bugs that we might unintentionally step on. But there might be some times in our life where we must apply upaya or skillful means and put up a solid physical boundary or a solid no, or use the levers and tools of justice and the criminal system to help others also become awake. So it's important to have compassion and to love everybody. And in understanding how a person's story in the past has shaped them be who they are today, it might have some deep samskaras or mental impressions to make them have a propensity towards violence and ill will. And you might encounter people in your life who have some propensity to violence and ill will because of the unfortunate circumstances that they grew up in. So we can have this understanding and we can cultivate that understanding and still say no, right? And whatever that might be, we can apply upaya. We don't need to be so fully blind to these principles that we forget what needs to happen in this moment and what barrier needs to be set up in this moment. We know that hurt people hurt people. We know that there's no need to blame an individual for the behaviors because they grew up in a society and in a system that allows these behaviors to continue. And we can also see ourselves in them and them in us. We can recognize that the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And at the same time, not be a rug that is simply walked over. We can empathize with a person's behavior, but that doesn't mean condoning or enabling it. And how that applies in your life will require some skillful means, will require some upaya. So, yes, we are here to let go of the past, but that doesn't mean let go of the meaning that we can make from the events that have happened in our lives. A monk might have certain vows of celibacy and not touching a member of the opposite sex. But if a member of the opposite sex is drowning in the water and has one hand reaching out, upaya is breaking that vow and pulling the person out from drowning. And if we take this metaphor one step further, we have to begin with ourselves. Meister Eckhart also makes a very important point that if you do want to save somebody from drowning, you have to make sure you have your own feet on solid ground. You can't jump in the water with them. Otherwise, that person will take you down with them. So, on the spiritual path, you can only go as far as you have gone yourself. And we can be kind to ourselves as we move towards more kindness, more mindfulness, and more skillfulness in our thoughts, words, and actions, while embracing and learning from the mistakes that we make along the way. Because all those mistakes, all those events that we might be tempted to regret and wish things had gone differently in the past, they too made you who you are today. And you would not be who you are today without those trials and tribulations and challenges that happened to you early on in life. So as we spin the yarn of our stories to make beautiful tapestries, as we make meaning of our lives and turn it into a poem and turn it into a song. No one wants to hear songs all the time of just sunshine and rainbows. We are here to integrate both the light and the dark. So we integrate the pain, the suffering, the loss, the grief in our life into the masterpiece that we are creating, into the art and poetry and song that we are creating. And that is the other lesson of the dawn chorus. The next time you are awake before the sun rises, quiet the mind, listen to the birds around you, and you will find they do take shifts. The birds that can see more easily in the night wake up earlier and begin their song, and then they finish singing, and other birds take over. So even the birds have a role and a purpose to play as they sing their song. And you too have a role and a purpose to play. So as you create your own narrative coherence and understand the poem, the song, the story that is your life, also recognize you're also a key part of this larger story of humanity that is being written right now through our thoughts, words, and actions. Hmm. So I had a few more stories I wanted to get to. We'll have to save them for next week. So this is part one of the deeper meaning behind Zen stories. And I sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, hope that you can join me for part two. And to close out, let's be with our breath, straightening the spine, relaxing the shoulders, closing the eyes or keeping them slightly open. Notice the in-breath and out-breath. And take a few moments and honor your story. Your past is inside of you. Your ancestors are inside of you, wishing you on. Countless people have dreamed you into being. Countless generations have sung song to their children, told stories full of truth, so that we may awaken to the love, compassion, kindness that is right here. And I thank you for sharing with me your song, your story, your poem. And thank you for being part of my story, for we are all connected. Namaste.